Torah. And I won't be able to see the looks on the people behind me as they either agree or disagree, but you will. And then after Shabbos, I'll go back and watch to see what their reactions were. But I do want to share what I think is an important message at this moment in history. So you know that for the past few months, we have been living through this pandemic. And it has created for all of us a series of moments strung together that have been filled with anxiety. For most of us in this community, it's an anxiety that is made prevalent because of the scary moments of health. For the most part, this is a community living here in the suburbs that isn't so affected by finances. For many of us, there is money that will carry us through this. For many of us, living socially distant isn't so challenging because we don't live so close to each other. We're not living on top of each other. I can walk my dog on the streets and almost never come across a single other individual. And if I do, I can slap on my mask and continue on safely. For me, the anxiety of this pandemic is one in which I fear for the lives of so many of our community who are in that sphere of people who are most at risk, whether they be elderly or immunocompromised. And there is understandable anxiety. But for a world out there outside of this small community here on the shores of the Hudson, the anxiety is compounded by a daily existence that's challenged by living one on top of another in the most highly dense population that can be found almost anywhere here in the United States. Living in housing that is challenging in the best of circumstances, making a living that's hard in the most fluid economy. Here, living on the shores of the Hudson, life is beautiful. But living in the inner city, life is challenging. And so we have seen the confluence of events of a pandemic in the background and civil unrest on the foreground. It is the first time in the course of the last 3 months that we have spoken about almost anything else other than the pandemic. We have been so overwhelmed by our own individual lives and security that we have forgotten that there are people who struggle every day. Not just because of the economic pressures, not because only of their living circumstances, but because there are people within our country who are daily subject to racism. We as a people understand what it means to be the object and the victim of significant hate. We established an organization called the Anti-Defamation League because of the pressure we felt as a nation, as a people, when others hate us so much. It uniquely positions us both as Jews and as people of privilege to be able to speak on behalf of those who don't have a voice. And that leads me to this week's Parsha. In this week's Parsha, Parshat Naso, we come across the ordeal of the Sota. This is a challenging moment for a husband and wife that plays itself out in the public arena. A husband accuses his wife of being unfaithful, of being an adulteress. He brings her before the community and he says, I charge her with this act. And then unfolds one of the most challenging, difficult ordeals ever described in the Torah, the ordeal of the Sotah. Her hair is exposed. She's forced to drink a potion that's supposed to, if she's guilty, cause her to die an extraordinary death. It is an ordeal. It's a trial by ordeal. And there are people in our country right now who are suffering an extraordinary ordeal. Look, we live in a time in which George Floyd dies because of police brutality in an environment of white supremacy. And we recognize immediately that this is a plague on our country. And we have to do everything in our power to stand up against it. There is inherent racism in our nation. And this is this week's Parsha, a trial by ordeal. So similar in its exposing of an underpinned hatred that is pervasive in our country. And then the whole book of Numbers continues. And finally, near the very end of the book of Numbers, we have this moment of the Benot Tzalafchad, the daughters of Tzalafchad. I remind you that in the ordeal of the Sota, this woman has no voice. She doesn't have the opportunity to stand up and defend herself. She doesn't get to say anything. But at the very end of the book of Numbers, we have the daughters of Tzalafchad who say there is an injustice in the system. Why do only men inherit land? We too ought to be able to inherit land. And God takes a moment and steps back. In discussion with Moses, they decide that that's truly an injustice. Vatikrana v'ta'amodna, they stood up and they called out, and the response to that call is the response that in fact there is injustice and it has to be changed. There has to be a correction. And women inherit for the first time in the Torah because somebody stood up and said this is unjust. And I imagine how difficult it must have been for those women to step forward. The courage, the risk, the exposure. As Aviva Zornberg points out in her book Bewilderments, the passivity of the Sota, her muteness, are highlighted by the significant words that link these two narratives. Strikingly, the story of the five sisters begins with the verb vatikravna v'ta'amodna. They approached and they stood in the unusual feminine plural form. These verbs describe a posture, an approach. Even before we hear them speak, they imply courage, risk, exposure before the highest court of the people. We will need to do such a thing. We will need to embody that risk, that courage, that exposure in order to correct this moment in the history of our nation. You know, you have heard me say so many times in the past that I pray that one of the silver linings of this pandemic is a correction in our system. That those things that we held to be important that are now no longer relevant will find a permanent correction when we return. Our investment in material possession seems to be less important today than it did before the pandemic. The way we speak to each other, we pray, has found a correction in this moment of a pandemic. And this moment of pandemic affords us the opportunity for another correction in our system, and that is the inherent racism that exists within our nation. I know there are those out there who say, I'm overreaching. That in fact the problem isn't as big as it seems to be. There are those who will say it's one bad apple. And while I agree with so much of that sentiment, because I do believe in our men and women in blue, that they are good and they seek out justice. In fact, there are bad apples, and that cannot be tolerated. And we cannot permit a nation to continue in its civil discourse that maligns and demeans other human beings. This week's Parsha says there will be individuals who will be singled out and incarcerated against their will for only existing. And there needs to be people who stand up against such hatred and violence. We come by our racism historically. We bought and sold people. It is one of the original sins of our nation. And we must do everything in our power at this moment to recognize that this sin, this transgression, must be overcome and not perpetuated. I pray that when this pandemic is over and we come back together, we understand the love and the peace that we missed so much as we stood side by side with our friends and families before the pandemic and now value so much more. I pray that when we return after this pandemic and we recognize how many thousands of lives have been lost, that every life matters. And that we have to do everything in our power to take this moment of reflection, this time out caused by a pandemic, to realign our values and to make sure that we do everything in our power to preserve every human life, and that every one of us has value, and that for those of us who don't have a voice, we can rely on those who do. And for every day that I have a voice, I pray that I will use it in such a way as to elevate every human life. And may that be our prayer. May that be more than just a hope. May we bring it into action through community organizing, through voting. You know how you hate when I speak about politics. But this isn't about politics. It's about human rights. Shabbat Shalom. I want to thank the Hemmerdinger family, the Bond family, for being here with me this Shabbos. I want to thank everybody out there who tuned in. I wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.